Good morning. When I unveiled the governor's budget recommendations in November of 2019, Florida enjoyed low unemployment and steady economic growth, and we had not yet even heard that there was a virus circulating in Wuhan, China. As the legislature began putting together its FY 2021 budget in February, COVID-19, of course, had been identified, but many experts downplayed the threat that the virus posed to the United States. Indeed, even as the legislature passed its budget in early March, the notion that the economy would shut down was not something that was really seriously being entertained. Of course, things changed quickly. As March wore on, businesses and travel ground to a halt. Our theme parks here in Florida closed, people canceled vacations, and as a state driven by tourism and hospitality, we were staring down the barrel of an unprecedented economic collapse. Even more ominously, by mid-March, it was clear that the adverse clinical consequences of COVID-19 infection skewed heavily towards the elderly. As a large state with one of the oldest populations in the nation, on demographics alone, Florida is likely to be more impacted by COVID than any other state in the union. And if at that time, one were to have forecast how Florida would fare in terms of COVID impacts and in terms of economic performance relative to the nation as a whole, most would have predicted that Florida would do worse, indeed far worse, than the national average. And to be sure, Florida endured a difficult and tumultuous year like everybody else. March and April witnessed job losses the likes of which we've never seen. The toll of mitigation and social distancing weighed heavily on the mental and physical health of Floridians. And most significantly, of course, Florida's had thousands of good people pass away with COVID, which has affected families and communities in every corner of the state. And yet, through all that, as we stand here today, Florida's per capita COVID mortality is less than the national average and less than 25 other states, virtually all of whom have younger populations than Florida. And in December, as the nation saw a net job loss, Florida added more than 20,000 new private sector jobs. Our unemployment rate is lower than the nation's as a whole and much lower than many of our peer states. The pandemic required Florida to lead. We've done so, and we will continue to do so. From the very beginning of the pandemic, we made evidence-based decisions that targeted our elderly population for focused protection. Florida's early actions to protect our vulnerable population, our most vulnerable population, such as our residents of long-term care facilities, set the standard that many others later emulated. And most recently, Florida led by focusing our vaccination efforts on our 65 and older population. We rejected recommendations that were not evidence-based. We put seniors first, and other states soon followed. As of today, Florida reports vaccinating nearly 1.1 million of our seniors, representing more than 24% of our enormous elderly population. Florida leads the nation in vaccinating seniors, and we will not let up until every senior who wants a shot gets a shot. Florida also led and continues to lead on protecting the livelihoods of our people. While so many other states kept locking people down, Florida lifted people up. We believe every job is essential. If you work in a restaurant, we have your back. If you are a hairstylist, we protect your right to earn a living. And if you are a parent, we ensure your kids have the right to attend school in person. Lockdowns do not work. School closures have been disastrous. Yet even today, we see across our country businesses shuttered, lives ruined, and schools closed. Indeed, in major parts of the country, students might not return to in-person instruction until the fall. Florida schools are open. Every Floridian has a right to work. All businesses have a right to operate, and Florida is better for it. The Florida Leads fiscal year 2021-2022 budget exemplifies Florida's strength and our continued resolve in weathering this storm. Now, early on, before we even knew the precise contours of how COVID-19 would impact Florida's economy, I took proactive steps to ensure Florida's fiscal health. For the current year's budget, I vetoed $1 billion out of the $93.2 billion budget to make sure that we were prepared for any unknown impacts that COVID-19 could have on our economy. We also strategically maximized more than $4.5 billion in federal coronavirus relief funds in the current fiscal year for pandemic response. I also directed state agencies to set aside 6% of their current year's budget in order to give the state more financial flexibility in our response to the pandemic. This amounted to over $800 million that could be leveraged if needed. Now, these actions, as well as, of course, keeping Florida open while prioritizing the health of our vulnerable citizens, have resulted in a $2.1 billion increase in revenues since the worst-case scenario estimates were released in August of 2020. This means that Florida did not need to dip into the budget stabilization fund or other traditional reserve funds in order to stay fiscally afloat throughout 2020. And already in January, we're seeing our revenue estimates come in over the new improved predictions, which is a testament to the strength of Florida's recovery. In fact, in December, we saw revenues exceed the estimates by over $300 million, and we expect in January to see at least $100 million more than what was forecast. And so despite the unprecedented circumstances and historic reductions, Florida leads budget for fiscal year 2021-2022 totals more than our current budget last year. It's $4.3 billion more. Most of that is directly related to COVID response efforts, both in the Division of Emergency Management and a large increase in Medicaid enrollment, which is directly related to COVID. And so $2.6 billion increase related to COVID expenditures. Lion's share of that is Medicaid. The overall increase in Medicaid is about $3 billion year over year. And our Department of Emergency Management increase for pandemic response is $400 million. And so outside of the pandemic response, the budget increases year over year by about 2%, $1.7 billion. And actually, there's a decrease in the level of general revenue over the current fiscal year when you control for the COVID-related expenditures. And while our economic outlook remains strong, we've not fully realized COVID-19's impact. The Florida Leads budget takes this into account and includes over $1 billion in reductions over the current fiscal year and next. And although there are more than $1 billion in reductions, the Florida Leads fiscal year 21-22 budget continues to make important investments in our education system and the environment and puts Florida on solid financial footing with $6.6 billion in total reserves, including $2.2 billion in unallocated general revenue to ensure that our state's economic viability endures. Now, parents, students, and families and teachers have faced significant disruptions and challenges due to COVID-19 pandemic. Despite these circumstances, Florida remains committed to providing the best education possible for our students. When we saw the pandemic hit, we took the appropriate step of suspending Florida statutes relating to the funding of our school districts, and this was done to ensure that our schools were held harmless in funding as students converted to virtual and blended instruction. This decision protected over $729 million in state funding for our K through 12 system. And of course, when we got into the summer, we made the decision that this continued flexibility was contingent on all school districts providing parents the option to send their kid back to school in person. We didn't force parents to do that if they preferred virtual or for whatever reason, but we understood the data very early on. We understood that the schools were low risk in terms of coronavirus, but we understood the huge risk and the huge negative consequences of shutting the schoolhouse door indefinitely on all our students throughout the state of Florida. And as we know, a lot of the people who keep kids out of school somehow find a way to send their kids to in-person instruction at a private school. You know, we wanted to stand by all families and make sure that they had the right to be able to do that. There was a lot of consternation when that was happening. And at the time, you had people, even some experts, that were fear-mongering. Now, pretty much everyone acknowledges the evidence. Very few people would really dispute that kids should be in school in person. And so you're seeing more and more people move to that. I know there's going to be some places where you're probably not going to see it, but that's more based on politics. That's more based on special interests than it is based on the well-being of our students and our families. And so we said with Commissioner Corcoran for the spring semester, we're open. Parents, we're going to stand by you. Make sure you have that right to send your kid to in-person instruction. We had a great year last year in the budget in terms of education. I proclaimed that it would be the year of the teacher. We said we wanted to increase the average minimum salary for public school teachers in the state of Florida to make us one of the top 5 in the country, and we were able to do that. This budget builds off that success, which we're very proud of. So K through 12 funding comes in at $22.8 billion. With $12.9 billion in state funding. That's $8,019 per pupil, which is $233 above current year. Base student allocation increase of $132 over current year. $550 million, which is an increase of $50 million, will be used to continue raising the minimum K through 12 teacher salary to the goal of getting the average minimum salary statewide to be $47,500. And we also include salary increases for other eligible teachers and instruction personnel. We've increased for a total of $110 million money for mental health programs in our schools. And although Florida opened schools and although we had activities over the summer, kids are much happier here than some of these other parts of the country, there's going to be mental health fallout even under the best of circumstances. And so we want to be ready for that. We also have a new initiative, $43.5 million, to establish the Title I School Recognition Program to provide financial awards to eligible Title I schools based on their student performance. A total of $1.2 billion in state operating funding for Florida's college and a total of $2.7 billion for Florida's universities is also included in the budget, and we do not allow any tuition increases. Budget also maintains important funding for practical skills-based education opportunities, including workforce initiatives and computer science education, $10 million to cover the cost of training and to provide bonuses to teachers who hold educator certificates or industry certifications in computer science, $10 million for the Pathways to Career Opportunities grant program to establish or expand pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs for high school and college students. You know, if you look at what some of these young people can make as welders, as electricians, they make more than a lot of the college graduates, especially if you're studying, majoring in like intersectional studies or something that really doesn't have any type of real world application. $30 million for state colleges through the 2+2 Student Success Incentive Fund and the Work Florida Student Success Incentive Fund to help students graduate on time and align career programs with workforce demands and high-wage jobs opportunities. And so last year's budget, current fiscal year, Florida led on education, and we're going to continue that momentum. We're going to continue to lead going forward. We're also going to continue with our momentum, and we're going to continue to lead with respect to environment, water quality, and natural resources. It's an important issue for our state, up and down every single coast and interior part. We continue to fund our water quality at $625 million, which was consistent with my executive order I issued during my first week in office. And of that $625 million, $473 million will be for Everglades restoration, $50 million for springs restoration, $145 million for targeted water quality improvements, $40 million for alternative water supply, and $25 million to combat harmful algal blooms and red tide. This is a priority. It's something that we have to continue the momentum going forward, and it's something that our budget shows our commitment to doing so. We also are introducing another step which has flowed out of some of the early actions we've taken involving mitigation and resiliency. And so we're going to establish the Resilient Florida program. And the purpose of this is to tackle the challenges posed by flooding, intensified storm events, sea level rise, and the program will provide $1 billion over 4 years to provide grants to state and local government entities to fund projects to adapt regionally significant assets to address the impacts of intensified storms, localized flooding, and sea level rise. So we believe that this makes a lot of economic sense when you look at how an insurance market would view property insurance, and to see that Florida is leading and trying to get ahead of some of these impacts, we think it'll be a very smart thing to do. We're also leading on health, including and specifically mental health. Our great First Lady has taken the lead on bringing together stakeholders to discuss and find solutions for the mental health challenges facing our state. The effects of social isolation and separation from loved ones have exacerbated the need for mental health services and support. I was down in Sun City Center senior community in the Tampa Bay area, and we set up a pod to do 1,000 seniors a day. So we'll do 5,000 over 5 days. They got about 11,000, I think, people in their community, and some of them had already been vaccinated. But number of people who are crying when they're getting these vaccines, because many of the people have been self-isolating or at least cutting back on their normal activities in some respects. And so the sense of relief is really real and palatable. I got a letter from a fellow who was 95, and he said that he went, got the vaccine at the end of December, thanked us for putting seniors first, said, you know what, I had to wait in line for a couple hours, but I didn't care because I want to get on with my life. And so I think that you're going to see that as being something we're going to have to address writ large throughout society. The vaccines are going to help us get people back, but this is not something that the society has really gone through to this level, and there's going to continue to be impacts for that, particularly with parents and children. They've struggled, and of course our seniors have struggled, and so what we are some of the things that we do take for granted, like having senior centers, people that would get together, seniors, that has been dialed back. In fact, we delivered 15.4 million meals, which is a 200% increase from year over year as a result of this. So the impacts are really, really real. We're including $32 million to provide funding for services to children and families who receive services through Florida's child welfare system. The funding provides support for foster care parents who care for children removed from their homes and families who adopt children from the foster care system. Last year, over 4,500 children were adopted into more than 3,000 families in Florida. It's very important that we continue to support our children who are in need of a loving family. Budget also includes more than $31 million for adults and children who suffer from mental illness and emotional disturbances. And additionally, we're continuing the fight against the national opioid epidemic. Budget includes more than $178 million in state and federal funding for the opioid epidemic, $51 million in funding for APD waiver programs to allow more people with disabilities to live in their communities. We have 2 vaccines now and more on the horizon, so there's a light at the end of the tunnel, not only for our seniors, but for all who love them, and so we're going to keep pushing on that. We're also continuing our commitment to public safety. I think we don't have the crime statistics from 2020. 2019 was another reduction. You've seen steep increases in crime in major cities throughout the United States. I think we've handled it better in Florida. I think a lot of our local law enforcement and local jurisdictions have been more responsible than many in these other parts of the country. However, I think we need to brace that we could see potentially crime increase, and so we continue to support public safety in a significant way. We're also continuing to support our infrastructure and road programs. We fully fund the DOT work program. We're also doing, for the first time, a $50 million Governor Road Fund. There's times where we want to be able to put money in quickly, to be able to do targeted infrastructure improvements that could really assist the economy. So we're asking the legislature to do that. I know it's been done in the past, just not the recent past. So we think that our state's growing. If you look at what's happened this year, home sales are up over 20% year over year. Home prices up over 14%. I have friends who will tell me people will just call them and ask them to buy their homes. They're not even selling the homes. And so I think you've seen people vote with their feet. I think people are moving jobs and businesses here. And look, people are free to move around the country as they want. But we've got to have a strong infrastructure system to be able to contend with that. Part of that's the water resources, but part of that is our roads. And I tell you, when people come from some of the high tax states, one of the things they say is, gee, I pay so much more in taxes there, and yet your roads are better here. So we want to continue that and make sure that we're doing right by Florida families. So it's been a very difficult year. We were in a different posture when we unveiled the governor's recs in 2019, at the end of 2019. I am, though, I think, pleased at the progress we've been able to make economically in very tough circumstances. I don't think people would have thought we would have been able to get through to this point without using the Budget Stabilization Fund. I don't think people would have thought that we'd be able to unveil a budget that maintains $6.6 billion in reserves, including $2.2 billion in unallocated general revenue. And understand, we know the revenue is going to come in over projections now for these next many months. None of those increases are even included in our budget. So, you're looking at hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars between today and July 1st that, the legislature will be able to use if they see fit. And so we wouldn't have been able to do this, I think, without trusting Floridians and supporting their right to earn a living, supporting rights of businesses to operate. And we just want to, we've led on so many things. We want to be the leader in the post-COVID environment. We're not there yet. Got a lot more work to do on the vaccines in particular, but I think that we have the opportunity to lead even more, and we're looking forward to doing that. Mike?
Yeah, Governor, you mentioned the very first picture and you also haven't mentioned any other revenue enhancements. Are there any in your budget, and how do you explain the legislature's pessimism?
Well, I mean, the numbers are the numbers. The fact is, if you look at like December, we had $330 million above what the forecast had been. We know January is going to be over forecast for sure. I think what we'll do, and we'll have our folks in front of the legislature, next in front of the committee. I think one of the things that I may not have been as appreciated, we vetoed the $1 billion. We've held back some money, which may not be quite as appreciated, but the strategic use of the CARES Act, the way that was used very smartly to be able to handle the pandemic and really serve as an important bridge for us, we really focused on that. I mean, every day we were trying to figure out, how do we make sure this works? Because when we were in April and May, we knew we had CARES money. We didn't know what the revenue outlook was going to be. And so the fact is, I don't think anyone would have thought that we're over 0.5% less in unemployment than the national average right now. I mean, if you think about it, the tourism, it's done better than it was in April, but it isn't back to where it was because there's still a lot of people that don't want to travel. We have the foreign travel. I supported the Brazil and the Europe because I think that this is an endemic seasonal virus at this point. I don't think there's much difference in kind of someone coming from Ohio or someone coming from Brazil. Obviously, that's getting dialed back. So if we had that going, we'd probably be under 5%. And so I think that the momentum has been good. So I think once it's explained kind of how those expenses were done, I think people will understand. But I mean, the reserves are the reserves. I mean, we were not going to do anything without having sufficient cushion for us, and we've managed it well. So I think when they'll do that, I think folks will appreciate kind of where we're coming from, and obviously we'll work through it to be able to have a good budget. So I've wanted to do a deal with the Seminole tribe. We've worked with them. Obviously, there's a lot of different irons in the fire there. I know the legislature has done it. I'd like to be able to to get a deal. We're not in our budget. I guess Mike had asked too. We're not. There's no tax increases in our budget. We're not going to do that. We've cut the $1 billion early. We withheld the spending. We've used CARE strategically, and I think that's the best approach for us. Did you? Nope. No, we don't assume. Now, look, whatever they're out, we're going to take. I mean, I'm going to leverage whatever that is for our state the best I can. And so if they do that, we're going to make good use of it. But we assumed that there's just not going to be anything else. And I think that was the appropriate thing. It's also important, some of the stuff I was discussing when we talk about the education, all that, there's been a lot of federal money that's gone down. And in fact, we have some of the more recent stimulus money. There's a lot more in education that's not even reflected here. We're going to have some announcements on that very soon, but there's some exciting things that we're going to be able to do on that front as well. So I think that for those who are saying, oh, education is just going to get whacked, I think we were showing, not only in terms of our budget, but also with some of the other things that you're going to see with the federal funds. And if they want to do more, they can do more. But it's a little frustrating because it seemed like once January 20th came, there was a different view about opening up businesses. Before, it was viewed as this horrible thing to let someone make a living. Now, you have places that are saying, "Oh no, we need to get all this open." It's just odd that would happen on a dime like that. But the fact is, we're in better shape because we made decisions that benefited the state. And I think other areas have done things that have really, really destroyed their societies, their economies. And, maybe they'll come back, but I think it's going to be a lot easier for Florida because we took a lot of steps early and we kept the state afloat. Yes, sir. So the biggest general revenue reduction is because when they do the enhanced FMAP, that allows us to save general revenue. So that's hundreds of millions of dollars. We're also, with Schools of Hope, doing two things. We're not putting any new money into Schools of Hope, which we had typically been doing 40, 50 million. And then we're also taking back from the kitty, because there's a 200 some million dollars just sitting in the kitty. So we're taking back another 50 million to be able to shore up the budget. And then there's some other things that are a little bit smaller than that, but I'd say those are some of the two or the bigger ones. Well, the health has gotten a lot of money now with a lot of the stuff that's come down. I mean, that's much different than where they were previous to that. DEO, Dane Eagle's doing a great job. I mean, there's a couple things with that is if you look at where we were in February when you have 2.9% unemployment, we didn't need a lot of people employed there. In fact, they had too many people. And then to go from zero to unprecedented, they had to do it. But that level that was needed in March, April, May is not something I don't think that's going to be needed necessarily going forward. But the different stuff that we've had to deal with, re-engineering that, I mean, we did put a lot of money into that. We had to do a lot of work because this thing was just not functioning. So we want that to be functional. We're obviously supporting, I think enough funding to be able to get that done. Not through the budget. I mean, I think that we're going to look at, Dane has done a really good job on that. I mean, we've paid out, unprecedented amount. I mean, you probably could go back. We've probably paid out more this year than year over year than the last decade. I mean, it's been a lot of money. So that's obviously was his top priority to make sure that that's accessible. But I've also learned that when you have these things where millions of people hit, I mean, man, we've seen that with the vaccines. I mean, when Publix opens a website, they have to have a fleet of people that throttle it because you'll have 1 million people hit it all at once, and so you got to slow it down and do all that other stuff. So that was really, really, I think unprecedented in terms of the access that we saw from the system. You got anything?
Yeah, Governor, one question specifically talking back on what Gary was talking about. DOH talked about the $1.9 billion in CARES Act funding going to various improvements at DOH to help out with the pandemic. That $1.9 billion, was that direct from Treasury, or did that come out of the pile of money that the state got, that some of it went to the counties? I think it came in May or June.
I'd have to ask Spencer. It was the which one? Yeah, and I mean, if you look what they just did, I mean, there's even more. I mean, there's we're getting huge amounts of money for some of the testing, which I'm not sure that is necessarily the best use of it at this point, because we have all these rapid tests out there. And so they've been getting a lot of money. Now, some of the stuff, I think we've learned some lessons about, what has been effective and what's not been effective. And some of the things, that I think we thought maybe just weren't as effective. Okay, we got one more.
Can you talk about the number of people who are losing jobs? How many state employees are going to be part of this?
So, sure. So it actually ends up a net increase in FTEs, and it's solely due to us continuing on the corrections. We're committed to doing, General Lynch really believes in the 8.5-hour shifts instead of the 12-hour shifts. So we kind of did a pilot last time. We're going to continue doing that. So that leads to an increase, but the overall, I think what are we reducing FTEs other than 100 and something? Yeah. So, but look, the corrections need to be addressed, and General Lynch has asked for some of these things. Obviously, ideally, I would like to not have to do it, but I think that it's the right thing to do, so we're doing it. Okay, one more.
My quick follow-up is that when you were in Congress, you supported block grants and capping amounts of Medicaid. Yet it's clear that the actions taken by the federal government to increase the reimbursement amount is helping you balance your budget. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, but to compare like peacetime expansion with like this crisis situation, we've done a lot of things that if we didn't have this going on, then obviously it probably wouldn't have passed muster. So I think it's just a different situation. And also, federal government has a responsibility. They're one of the reasons why we had all the budget fallout. If you go back and remember, it went from go on a cruise the second week of March, it's fine, to the world's going to end. A lot of the fallout we saw in March was not because of the state government. It was just people were reacting to that. The theme parks closed. All these other things happened. And so I feel they have a responsibility to help the states weather through it, because I do think that they were responsible for some of this, even though technically they didn't necessarily tell Disney to close or whatever. But when they were doing this stuff, you saw it. It happened, and it was almost overnight. Within like a 5 to 7 day period, we went from people saying, make sure you're washing your hands, doing all that, to then saying that people basically just needed to stay in their homes. And that was a drastic shift. I think a lot of people got very, very frightened by that. I think if you look at how people responded to that, the number of people that would go to emergency visits all of a sudden decline in an unprecedented fashion for heart attacks and strokes and all this. Those things were still happening. It's just people were scared to go because they thought they were going to get coronavirus and die. And so it was a very, very frightening time for a lot of people. But I think for the federal government to recognize that they were a part of the reason why some of the states lost revenue and everything, I think that's totally appropriate. Spencer's going to be here. I got to do more stuff with vaccines. He's got to answer any of the other questions that y'all have. So thank you.